Grief is not merely an emotion. It is an initiation, a descent into the underworld of the soul where you are forced to confront the fragility of existence and the inevitability of loss. We often imagine grief as something to be avoided, suppressed, or quickly overcome, but this denial only deepens the wound. True strength does not come from escaping grief, but from facing it fully, allowing its fire to burn through you until it transforms the very foundation of your being. To grieve is to confront reality stripped of illusions, and in doing so, to encounter both death and life in their rawest forms. Grief begins with the shock of loss, and in that moment, the psyche instinctively recoils, refusing to acknowledge what has truly happened. The mind creates illusions. Perhaps this is temporary. Perhaps things will return to the way they were. Perhaps if I wait long enough, the absence will vanish. This refusal is natural, for the human being is deeply resistant to finality, and to accept the reality of loss is to accept the mortality of all things, including oneself. Yet denial, however comforting in the short term, becomes poison to the soul. It traps the individual in a limbo where the wound is neither allowed to bleed openly nor given the chance to heal. To take the first step toward transformation, one must summon the courage to face reality directly, without veils, without fantasies, without escape. This acceptance is not passive resignation. It is not saying, "I do not care," or "it no longer matters." On the contrary, to accept is to acknowledge the full weight of what has occurred. It is to look directly at the void left behind and affirm, "This has happened. This is real. This is irreversible." Such honesty tears through the illusions of permanence that the ego constructs to protect itself, but in that tearing, the possibility of genuine growth emerges. For only when you face what has been lost can you begin to reorganize your life around that truth, rather than living in a ghostly imitation of the past. Acceptance also requires surrendering the constant question of why. The mind torments itself with endless speculation. Why this person? Why now? Why me? Such questions rarely bring peace. They are often attempts to bargain with fate, to resist reality by seeking an explanation that will undo it. But reality is indifferent to such bargaining. To accept means to release this futile struggle and to recognize that the event has already been written into the fabric of existence. It cannot be undone, but it can be integrated. In this integration lies the seed of transformation. There is also a profound humility in acceptance. To accept loss is to recognize the limits of your control, to see that no matter how strong, intelligent, or prepared you are, you remain subject to forces beyond your command. This recognition may wound the pride, but it also awakens the soul. It strips away arrogance and confronts you with the truth of human vulnerability. Yet within that vulnerability lies a deeper strength, for once you no longer cling to the illusion of absolute control, you become more capable of living authentically within the flow of life. To accept grief, then, is not to diminish what was lost, but to honor it. It is to affirm that its presence was real, and so too is its absence. The tears, the silence, the aching emptiness are all part of acknowledging that reality. Only through this direct encounter can you begin to walk the path from grief toward renewal. For what is denied cannot be healed, but what is faced becomes the foundation of rebirth. Grief is not a simple wound that heals with time. It is an earthquake that rearranges the landscape of the soul. When something or someone dear is taken from us, the world itself seems to shatter, and the pieces of our former identity lie scattered on the ground. The person we were before the loss no longer exists, for grief is not an external event alone, but an internal death, a breaking apart of the self. To face grief is to recognize that you cannot return to who you once were. A new self must emerge, one that has been reshaped by the fire of suffering. This transformation often begins in darkness, in the recognition that your old patterns of thought, your old attachments, and even your old values can no longer sustain you. The foundations on which you stood have crumbled, and the first impulse is despair. But despair, paradoxically, is the beginning of rebirth, for it forces you to release the illusions of stability and permanence. When you no longer cling to what has been lost, you begin to see that what is breaking within you is also what is making space for something new. Grief destroys, yes, but in that destruction lies the possibility of a more expansive and resilient self. This transformation is rarely smooth or gentle. The psyche resists change, and the ego clings to its familiar identity. You may feel torn between two selves, the one that longs to remain in the comfort of the past, and the one that is being pulled into an unknown future. This tension is painful, yet it is precisely this conflict that carves depth into the soul. The individual who embraces grief as transformation does not attempt to erase the suffering, but instead allows it to shape them, to deepen their understanding of life, of love, and of mortality itself. In many ways, grief is a kind of initiation. It strips away illusions and forces you into contact with the raw essence of existence. Those who endure it consciously become initiated into a deeper dimension of life. They learn that strength is not found in avoiding pain, but in enduring it and allowing it to alter them. They discover that the human being is far more capable of resilience than the ego ever imagined. Such transformation often results in a new clarity of purpose, a sharper sense of what matters, and a deeper compassion for the suffering of others. Thus, grief becomes the forge in which the self is remade. You do not simply recover from loss. You become someone different, someone whose very existence testifies to the reality of suffering and the possibility of renewal. To allow grief to transform you is to accept that pain is not merely a wound, but also a teacher, one that strips you of superficial attachments and reveals the deeper core of your being. In this way, the broken self becomes the foundation for a stronger, wiser, and more authentic life. When grief strikes, there is often an overwhelming temptation to resist it, to suppress the emotions, to bury them beneath distractions, or to pretend that nothing has changed. Yet repression only deepens the wound. The psyche is not fooled by denial. What is avoided does not vanish. It festers beneath the surface, manifesting later as anxiety, bitterness, or even physical illness. To resist grief is to allow it to possess you unconsciously. For whatever is pushed into the shadows of the mind inevitably shapes your life from the darkness. Facing grief consciously requires a radical honesty with oneself, a willingness to feel the pain fully, without escape routes or false consolations. To surrender to grief is not weakness, it is courage. It takes more strength to weep than to suppress tears, more strength to acknowledge the hollowness in your chest than to plaster over it with empty smiles. Jung understood that repression is never without consequence. The emotions that we refuse to feel become autonomous, almost like ghosts that haunt us in unexpected moments. By allowing yourself to consciously feel grief, through tears, through silence, through reflection, you take back power from what would otherwise rule you in secret. The conscious confrontation with grief is also a dialogue with the unconscious. Dreams, symbols, and unexpected moods often emerge during such times, carrying fragments of the meaning buried within the suffering. If you suppress your grief, you miss this dialogue, and with it, the opportunity to integrate the hidden wisdom of your pain. But if you allow the grief to speak, if you give it form through words, art, or quiet contemplation, you begin to transform raw suffering into understanding. This process demands patience. Grief is not a storm that passes quickly. It is a season of the soul. The conscious choice to endure it is akin to walking into a dark forest without a map, trusting that somewhere within the shadows lies a clearing. To resist the journey is to remain trapped at the edge of the forest, paralyzed, never discovering what lies beyond. By accepting grief consciously, you move forward, step by step, even if you cannot yet see where the path leads. Moreover, conscious acceptance prevents the hardening of the heart. Those who suppress grief often become numb, disconnected from themselves and from others, unable to feel deeply again. But those who allow grief its place remain alive, even in sorrow. Their hearts, though wounded, remain open. They learn that the ability to suffer consciously is also the ability to love deeply, for one cannot exist without the other. Thus, to face grief consciously is to choose life, even in the presence of death, even in the presence of loss. It is to acknowledge that pain is not the enemy, but an inevitable part of being human. In this confrontation lies the possibility of healing, not by erasing what was lost, but by carrying it within you in a transformed way, as part of the depth of who you are becoming. Grief, when approached consciously, reveals itself not only as suffering, but as a profound teacher of resilience. In the moment of loss, it seems that life has been shattered beyond repair, that the center has collapsed, and nothing can restore balance. Yet within this very collapse lies the potential for an inner rebirth. Jung believed that the psyche holds within it the capacity for renewal, but only if one endures the descent into the underworld of sorrow rather than fleeing from it. By facing grief rather than avoiding it, one cultivates the ability to withstand the weight of life itself, and this endurance becomes the seed of strength. Resilience is not born out of comfort, but out of confrontation with the unbearable. The more one tries to shield oneself from pain, the more fragile one becomes. It is through direct engagement with grief that the soul forges a kind of spiritual muscle, an ability to carry heaviness without breaking. Much like the body grows stronger by resisting weight, the psyche grows resilient by resisting despair without collapsing into it. This is not to say grief becomes lighter. It may remain just as heavy, but the individual grows more capable of carrying it. In this process, the self discovers that strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the capacity to hold vulnerability without being destroyed by it. A person who has confronted grief consciously learns that they can endure what they once believed to be unendurable. This realization transforms their relationship with life. Challenges that once appeared overwhelming now appear manageable, because the greatest wound has already been faced, and the self survived. Moreover, resilience built through grief carries a quiet wisdom, a humility before the realities of existence. One no longer clings to illusions of control or permanence. Instead, there emerges an acceptance that life is fragile, that everything cherished may be lost, and yet one can still continue. This knowledge does not embitter the heart, but enriches it with a deeper gratitude for what remains, for what is given, however briefly. In facing grief, resilience also gains a collective dimension. Those who have endured suffering often become a source of strength for others, not because they offer shallow consolations, but because their very presence communicates a lived truth. Survival is possible, even when the soul feels broken. They embody resilience not as abstract advice, but as living proof that the human spirit can rise from devastation. Thus grief, paradoxically, becomes the ground upon which resilience is built. Without grief, one remains untested, fragile, and unprepared for the inevitable trials of existence. Through grief, one discovers an inner core that cannot be taken away, no matter what external losses occur. It is this unshakable center, born from suffering, that allows one not only to endure but to live more deeply, with a strength that does not deny pain but integrates it into the wholeness of being. Grief, when approached consciously, reveals itself not only as suffering but as a profound teacher of resilience. In the moment of loss, it seems that life has been shattered beyond repair, that the center has collapsed, and nothing can restore balance. Yet, within this very collapse lies the potential for an inner rebirth. Jung believed that the psyche holds within it the capacity for renewal, but only if one endures the descent into the underworld of sorrow rather than fleeing from it. By facing grief rather than avoiding it, one cultivates the ability to withstand the weight of life itself, and this endurance becomes the seed of strength. Resilience is not born out of comfort, but out of confrontation with the unbearable. The more one tries to shield oneself from pain, the more fragile one becomes. It is through direct engagement with grief that the soul forges a kind of spiritual muscle, an ability to carry heaviness without breaking. Much like the body grows stronger by resisting weight, the psyche grows resilient by resisting despair without collapsing into it. This is not to say grief becomes lighter. It may remain just as heavy, but the individual grows more capable of carrying it. In this process, the self discovers that strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the capacity to hold vulnerability without being destroyed by it. A person who has confronted grief consciously learns that they can endure what they once believed to be unendurable. This realization transforms their relationship with life. Challenges that once appeared overwhelming now appear manageable, because the greatest wound has already been faced, and the self survived. Moreover, resilience built through grief carries a quiet wisdom, a humility before the realities of existence. One no longer clings to illusions of control or permanence. Instead, there emerges an acceptance that life is fragile, that everything cherished may be lost, and yet one can still continue. This knowledge does not embitter the heart, but enriches it with a deeper gratitude for what remains, for what is given, however briefly. In facing grief, resilience also gains a collective dimension. Those who have endured suffering often become a source of strength for others, not because they offer shallow consolations, but because their very presence communicates a lived truth. Survival is possible even when the soul feels broken. They embody resilience, not as abstract advice, but as living proof that the human spirit can rise from devastation. Thus grief, paradoxically, becomes the ground upon which resilience is built. Without grief, one remains untested, fragile, and unprepared for the inevitable trials of existence. Through grief, one discovers an inner core that cannot be taken away, no matter what external losses occur. It is this unshakable center, born from suffering, that allows one not only to endure, but to live more deeply, with a strength that does not deny pain, but integrates it into the wholeness of being. Grief also serves as a portal to empathy, for when one has been touched by profound loss, one is no longer naive to the silent battles carried by others. Before grief, we may live in a kind of blindness, assuming that suffering is something distant, something that belongs to others but not to us. Yet when it comes crashing down, stripping away our illusions of security, it opens the heart to a deeper recognition of the universality of pain. In our own tears, we hear the echoes of countless others who have wept. In our own emptiness, we recognize the hollow silence in the lives of those who have suffered before us. This shared wound binds humanity together in ways that intellectual understanding never could. Through grief, the ego is softened. That shell of self, concern, pride, and detachment is cracked, and through the fracture enters compassion. To see another mourning, to witness another's despair, is no longer something that can be dismissed or superficially consoled, for we know in the fibers of our being what that weight feels like. This experiential knowledge transforms empathy from sentimentality into authenticity. We no longer say, "I understand," lightly because we understand in truth. This empathy does not arise instantly. It is born after we have confronted our own sorrow without running away. For those who attempt to suppress or deny grief, the heart often hardens, becoming brittle with bitterness or indifference. But for those who endure it, allowing the pain to carve deep into their inner life, the heart expands instead of shrinks. It becomes vast enough to hold not only its own suffering, but the suffering of others. This is why those who have walked through the valley of grief often possess an aura of quiet compassion, not forced, but emanating naturally, for they no longer see suffering as something alien. Empathy born of grief also creates a bridge of connection. In our fragmented world, where people often feel unseen and unheard, this ability to truly recognize another's pain becomes an act of profound healing. Sometimes the most powerful thing one can offer is not a solution but a silent companionship, a presence that communicates, "I have walked where you now walk, and though I cannot take away your pain, I will not abandon you in it." This form of empathy is transformative. It does not erase grief, but it makes it bearable, reminding us that we are not alone in carrying it. Paradoxically, it is grief, so isolating at first, that makes us more capable of connection. What seemed like a purely destructive force reveals itself as a deepening of our humanity. By entering our own suffering, we find ourselves bound more closely to others, not by superficial ties, but by the recognition of the shared human condition. Thus, grief becomes a hidden teacher of compassion, shaping us into beings who can see and embrace others with greater tenderness, not despite our pain, but because of it. Grief, in its devastating blow, is not merely the end of something cherished. It is also the beginning of transformation, if one dares to endure its trial. When loss enters our life, it shatters the structures of meaning we once relied upon, leaving us in the ruins of what we thought was permanent. Yet, within those ruins lies the possibility of rebuilding, not a replica of what was lost, but a stronger and more resilient foundation of self. To face grief fully is to step into the fire of suffering, but it is also to be refined by it, to let it burn away illusions and reveal the core of what is essential. Strength does not come from avoiding pain, but from learning to walk through it with open eyes. When we lose, we are stripped bare, exposed to the raw truth of our fragility. This experience may feel unbearable, but it is precisely here that resilience is born. The human spirit, when tested, learns that it can withstand more than it imagined. Like a tree that bends in the storm yet does not break, we discover a hidden flexibility within ourselves, a capacity to endure the unbearable and still rise again. This strength is not loud or prideful. It is quiet, steady, and enduring, forged in the crucible of suffering. Grief also teaches endurance not only for ourselves, but for the challenges that await us in the future. Once one has walked through profound loss, the smaller frustrations and disappointments of life lose their power to overwhelm. We begin to see difficulties with new perspective, for we know what true pain feels like. Having survived the storm, the rain no longer frightens us. This resilience becomes a shield, not of hardness but of understanding, allowing us to face life's uncertainties with greater composure. Moreover, grief grants us the ability to transform wounds into sources of wisdom. To have suffered deeply is to carry scars, but those scars, rather than disfiguring us, become marks of our growth. They remind us of what we have endured, and they become symbols of our capacity to rebuild. Strength after grief is not about forgetting the pain, but about integrating it into our story in such a way that it deepens us instead of diminishing us. It is through this process that we grow into fuller, more authentic beings, capable of navigating life with greater courage. What grief ultimately offers is a form of strength that no comfort or ease could ever provide. Ease leaves us untested, fragile, and easily broken. Grief, however, though it wounds, also fortifies. It makes us stronger not by shielding us from suffering, but by showing us that we can endure it, survive it, and even emerge transformed by it. In this way, grief becomes not only a destroyer but also a builder, shaping within us a resilience that will carry us through all the battles yet to come. To face grief is also to learn the profound art of acceptance, not as passive resignation, but as an active embrace of reality as it is. The pain of loss often comes from our refusal to let go, from our clinging to what once was but can no longer be. We replay moments in our minds, we grasp at memories, we resist the truth that what we loved has changed or vanished. Yet it is only when we surrender this resistance that the weight of grief begins to lighten. Acceptance does not erase the ache, but it removes the bitterness of struggle against the inevitable. It teaches us to flow with life instead of waging war against its currents. Acceptance is not the forgetting of what has been lost. It is the acknowledgement that love and memory need not disappear simply because form has changed. When we accept, we realize that what we loved still lives within us, not in the exact shape it once had, but in the values, the lessons, the imprints that person or experience left upon our soul. To accept grief is to honor what was without chaining ourselves to an impossible return. It is to say, this has ended, but its meaning endures in me. Through acceptance, grief evolves from a wound into a teacher. We begin to see that life is never about permanence, but about movement, transformation, and continual cycles of birth and death. Every ending gives way to a new beginning, and every loss holds within it the seed of renewal. Acceptance allows us to witness this unfolding without collapsing into despair, for we are no longer fighting the nature of reality itself. Instead, we learn to align with it, to trust its rhythm, to find peace in its flow. This act of acceptance strengthens the soul because it brings us closer to truth. Life is impermanent. Everything we love, including ourselves, will one day pass. To deny this is to live in delusion. To accept it is to step into wisdom. Grief, then, is the harsh but necessary reminder of this eternal law, and acceptance is the key that unlocks its deeper meaning. By embracing this truth, we do not become cold or detached. We become more compassionate, more present, and more appreciative of the fleeting beauty of existence. Ultimately, acceptance transforms grief into a doorway. On one side lies suffering, resistance, and despair. On the other side lies clarity, resilience, and freedom. When we walk through this doorway, we emerge with a new understanding of life, that loss does not end us, that endings are not final, and that the heart, though it breaks, has an infinite capacity to mend and expand. In this way, acceptance is not the end of grief, but its culmination, the point at which sorrow becomes wisdom and pain becomes strength.